Hello from Estonia, and welcome back to the Startup in Estonia podcast, produced by Startup Estonia and hosted this season by me, Adam Rang. Now, as you may have noticed, our planet is in crisis. And actually, I might need to be a bit more specific about which one. In today's show, we're going to talk about what many people think is the biggest crisis of them all, which is our environmental crisis. And this isn't an easy subject to talk about, including for startups, which are sometimes part of the problem in many ways. You know, even like electronic digital solutions do require energy that often starts with burning fossil fuels. But startups are increasingly part of the solution too. And I'm not just talking about startups that are specifically focused on offering an environmental solution. Like all startups can think about how they reduce their impact on the environment and how they can communicate that to customers. But does that come at a cost? Does that reduce profits? Or can an environmental strategy be a fundamental part of a startup's growth strategy? Can going green actually be good for business? And how do customers know it's not just marketing? Well, to help us make sense of all of this, we have a guest today from a big startup that has gone green in a big way. They're literally green. You've probably seen their green branding all over the place. But they have also just launched like a really comprehensive environmental strategy. That startup is Bolt, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Bolt's head of sustainability, Sandra Särav. Welcome to the podcast, Sandra.
Thanks for having me. It's I hope I can shed some light on what you just mentioned. But just to maintain the expectations, it's not a massive, comprehensive strategy. It's just one bit of a longer sustainability strategy that we're working on at Bolt. Okay,
so it's something that's evolved over time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Sandra, I came here today by Bolt. I use Bolt pretty much every day. For people who don't live in the same bubble as me, maybe some people have never heard of Bolt somehow. Can you give the elevator pitch for Bolt?
Sure. Are you ready?
Yes.
Bolt is the largest European ride-hailing company that has expanded over time from merely being a transport platform offering ride-hailing to offering e-scooter solutions as well as food delivery and business delivery as well. We call ourselves to be the biggest from Europe because we are a European startup. We come from Estonia. We've been named to be the top 3 fastest growing company by Financial Times 2 years in a row. And this year we were named to be hottest unicorn of the year as well in Europe. And we've recently gone green beyond the color. So even though the company was started with the idea of reducing personal car ownership, we've actually now started offsetting and looking at more greener verticals of how people could move around in terms of urban mobility.
Perfect. And we've just reached the top floor in that elevator. And Sandra, it's really amazing because so I was on a Bolt scooter today and looking around, I saw so many other Bolt vehicles. And I thought it's incredible how quickly this one startup has really come to dominate our kind of public cityscape. And even I've been traveling around the Baltic states this summer within our Baltic bubble. And I now see a Bolt scooter as the de facto sign for the edge of the city limits. You see a Bolt scooter and you know you're entering a new town. So it's really shaping our kind of public landscape. It's can you give us the big numbers? How many rides? How are people taking with Bolt? Around the world?
I cannot go into specifics because it's business secrets, but I can say that we have over 1 million drivers across the globe. We're in 35 countries in more than 150 cities, and we do more than 1 million rides each day.
1 million drivers. And am I right in saying it started here in Tallinn with your founder just walking around taxi ranks trying to sign up? And he was, how old was he at the time?
19. Yeah, so basically Marcus had this idea. So he says it came up because he couldn't get a taxi when he wanted to go to a party. I don't think you were living in Tallinn at the time.
No.
But basically over the weekends, if you needed to get a taxi, you would first be on hold over the telephone for 15 minutes. And then they would let you know, I'm sorry, there's no car for you. So these things have luckily changed, right? But I mean, beyond the idea of just getting a car over the weekend, the idea was also that we have so many cars in Tallinn. And today we're facing 100,000 more cars by 2035. So we're a highly motorized society. I don't know if it's due to our history. You weren't allowed to have a car unless you had a ticket to buy a car during the Soviet times. Or people just figured this as a status symbol. And in any case, we have way too many cars in Tallinn. And Bolt offering those different verticals, like jump on a scooter or take a ride and then mix it with public transport, should help you actually to get rid of the personal car or extra personal car that you don't actually need in your family.
Mm-hmm.
Just a nice number here. Like Tallinn and Helsinki started more or less around the same time with this super urbanization. In Helsinki, it's less than 6% of households that have 2 or more cars. In Estonia, it's nearly 40% of households that have 2 or more cars.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I also wondered if another reason why it particularly took off in Estonia initially is because we really like straight talking. We like a fair price. We don't necessarily like kind of haggling and dealing with kind of middlemen and
so
stuff.
So we don't like talking to strangers.
Yeah. And I guess it is a big difference when you can you pay in advance on your phone. You don't have to kind of, negotiate on what the price is for a taxi ride. And Sandra, what's your role at Bolt?
Well, as of 1st of July, I'm the head of sustainability, but I joined actually Bolt more than 1 year ago from the Estonian government. And then I served as the head of regulatory for Baltics and Nordics, or public policy manager for Baltics and Nordics. So I'm working both with regulatory issues still in Baltics since I'm shifting to this new role. But essentially, I'm the head of sustainability, meaning I do need to figure out how our company can go more green in everything that we do. So that's not just recycling at the office or offsetting our rides, but each and everything that we do as a company. So how to be more green.
So you mentioned about kind of people using cars less. And so when we think about Bolt, and not just Bolt, but other kind of ride-sharing schemes in general, is it having like a net positive or negative effect on the number of rides people take? Is there any kind of data evidence around that? Kind of, does the availability of rides mean people are more likely to jump in a vehicle that they can quickly use rather than walk? Or is it people are reducing their dependence on their own personal vehicles as well?
Well, we hope there's a reduction of personal vehicles. I think this is more a longer-term strategy, and it depends what kind of options do you have available on the street, right? So for us, already having scooters plus ride-hailing on the same platform, and by the way, we were the very first ride-hailing platform to bring e-scooters on the same platform.
Okay.
We actually see that people who start using scooters switch from ride-hailing to scooters. So it's like 9% of people who previously took ride-hailing only now switch to scooters for shorter rides. So that's already a very good number. But in general, I think it's people who have more awareness of what it means to make more conscious choices in urban transport. They take this mixture of things, but it's also people who just don't have their cars and then they take a ride-hailing car just to get from point A to point B, or when they're drinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, yeah. And Sandra, before we look more at your environmental strategy, Bolt really dominates kind of here in our part of the world. How does that compare around the world? Like, do you, I think particularly in Europe and Africa, you're particularly big. Kind of why is that?
Yeah, so our main markets, so our focus markets are actually Europe and Africa. So we don't go to, let's say, North America or even Asia, because we see that those markets have supply enough as it is. So we call ourselves to be the most frugal company out there. So it's a very Estonian mindset, I think. Do more with less, right? So we're only 1,700 people as opposed to big competitors who maybe have 20, 30,000 employees working at the company. So we go to markets where we know we can be the first or the contender, where we don't have to, let's say, burn too much money just to get market access. So this way we actually save money to go to markets where we know we may win some market share.
And I guess in the past, there was more of a debate about kind of, is this the future? Do we want kind of ride sharing in our cities? But actually, am I right in thinking Estonia was the first country to legalize ride sharing in
Europe?
Yeah.
So in 2017, we changed the Public Transport Law, Public Transport Act. So basically to bring taxis and ride hailing on the same platform. The only differentiation point is how you order the taxi. To get it from a street via the call, to actually get it via an app. So this also means that if you get it via an app, you don't need to have a taxi meter in the car because the calculation of the route and the price is done via the application. Versus if you actually hail the car from the street or over the phone, you need to have an additional taxi meter in the car to do all the calculations. But this also means that for us as a platform taxi or transport service over the platform, we cannot do street pickups. So people cannot pick up a Bolt car from the street.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess there's no doubt this is the new normal now. There's an enormous demand. It's not going away.
I mean, we hope so, but it's not the case even in Europe.
Really?
Because many countries still haven't regulated, or they have such an old, outdated regulation in place that platform taxis are not even allowed. So, I mean, Germany, which otherwise, is a big, tech industry country, they have this stupid place. Sorry, but they're stupid rules still in place for taxi services. For instance, return to garage rule, meaning if now as a driver I take you to your destination, I have to go back to my initial point, which is not environmentally friendly. It also loses the most crucial time that is there for the taxi drivers, meaning that the time between when you drop off a client and pick up a new one should be the shortest, so you maximize your revenues. But if you go back to, let's say in Estonia, I take you to Nõmme and then I have to come back to Kesklinn, and maybe another customer was there at Nõmme already. So actually regulation comes into crucial place in this service.
But do you ever see things going backwards, or surely once people start using ride sharing, they get used to it, then it's very difficult for kind of local legislators try and turn back the clock and turn it off? Or do you see in some countries that there's pushback?
It has happened because the big American player in our field, they came to the market in Europe 5 or so years ago, and they didn't play by the rules. They introduced a service that was kind of in a gray area or outside of the scope of how the service should be offered, and then many regulators actually got upset, and then they started blocking the service in many of the markets. But we see, trends everywhere. When you don't liaise with governments or cities, when you don't want to become their friends, they might get upset and try to figure out ways how to block this novelty services altogether. Or maybe they just don't understand how a service works. And this is completely opposite of Estonia, right? Where we embrace new technologies versus a country where you think, okay, I'm going to actually regulate and not allow the service because I don't understand how it works.
And I guess cities kind of have to work with you because, transport is a huge part of cities' own environmental strategies, and they can't ignore the kind of reality if people are using services like this.
Yeah, and we need to talk to cities as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's very much a twofold, let's say, cooperation.
So Bolt has gone big on its kind of environmental strategy. What is the main motivation? Is it to increase profits or
Okay, so I mentioned when we started off in 2013, and when I say we, I mean the brother Villigs, because I wasn't in the game yet. So when we started off as a company in 2013, the idea was already then to reduce dependency on personal cars, right? So, do you own a car?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So how much do you use this car per day?
It's between me and my partner. So probably once a day we'll use it. Yeah.
So, normally a car sits in a parking lot 95% of the time. You're only using it 5% of the time to get somewhere. And then if you go to work, to the office, for instance, it sits there until you take it back home.
Yeah.
And then it sits in your home. Yeah. Then many places like Tallinn have 4 to 5 parking lots allocated for personal cars per car. So it's like 50 to 60 square meters of room just for one car, which is the size of an apartment, for instance. So we thought this was stupid, that the company needs to change how urban transport works. So this was already at the time. But now, fast forward to 2019, we realized, okay, we tried to make a change, but still people use this service as complementary to having their own cars. Or, in best case scenario, maybe they get rid of the second car in their family. But still, we have more or less 1 million cars around the world. Not us, but our drivers have roughly 1 million cars around the world, which are still, let's say, prevalently internal combustion engine cars. So gasoline, diesel cars, which are not that environmentally friendly. So we figured we need to do something, and then we started offsetting in 2019 in September. So basically, we took all of our European rides, we calculated, what's the car type, what's the motor it uses, how old is the car, what's the route it takes to the client, and then taking the client to the destination point. And then we calculated the CO2 emissions, and then we started offsetting them with a partner we have in the UK. So basically, we buy, let's say, emission credits. So these are highly standardized projects, certified. We know what we are buying into, and we now have been offsetting all our rides in Europe. But that's just step one.
Is the main impact of these initiatives on your bottom line to reduce operating costs, or does it add costs when you invest in these schemes?
Yeah, currently it adds cost, and we don't want to add anything to the users, so consumers. So it doesn't cost a cent more to the consumers. We pay the difference. Okay. But offsetting is the first step. This is something we do until there's no prevalent use of electric vehicles. Last week Elon Musk came out with the new battery proposals, which are going to cost 10 times less than they do now, which will also mean that the electric vehicle cost would go down from, let's say, 45,000 to maybe 25,000. But it's still, since our business model is that we have private drivers and they utilize their own personal cars for offering this service. It's going to be quite a high investment for them to switch from their personal cars to buy electric vehicles. So this is a longer term strategy. And as long as we don't have only electric vehicles on our platform, we have to figure out the way how actually we cut the emissions that we do with the current cars that we have.
Okay. Now, let me talk about this offsetting scheme then. So is this something that Bolt manages itself, or do you outsource it to companies that run these initiatives for you?
Yeah, so we did the calculations ourselves with our internal data scientists team. So what are the offsets actually? What are the CO2 emissions?
Mm-hmm.
Then we had this calculations method verified by a third party. So we used a company called Verifavia. They do those verifications also in maritime, in aviation, etc. They're ISO standardized and so forth. And then we interviewed a few companies and we chose Natural Capital Partners, which is our UK-based company. So basically, every quarter or so, we give them the numbers of what were the CO2 emissions, and they give us a list of projects where we can choose from, which are gold standard projects, VCS projects, so known in the industry. So we don't do greenwashing. We just don't go and finance random projects, but we actually choose from a list of certified projects, and then we offset via those projects, such as funding alternative fuel businesses, etc.
Okay. And I was going to ask about greenwashing. I guess this is the perception that kind of some companies are just doing something relatively small, tokenistic to reduce their environmental impact and to distract from much bigger issues they've got. How do customers know the difference between a company that's greenwashing and the company that genuinely believes in it, is doing it properly?
I think it's kind of tricky actually for customers. You need to do some extra research or you need to look into it, right? These days you have this closed retail companies who claim to have a sustainable line of clothing, right? Mm-hmm. But if you still pay maybe 10 euros for a sweater, can it really be sustainable? So that's a question. But in our line of company, I think we need to be very honest. So we're not saying that all of our rides are green globally, because it's very difficult to achieve this in Africa, where the main let's say concern is still how you get from point A to point B in a safe manner. They're still building their infrastructures, etc. So it's honesty from the companies at first point. When it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is too good to be true at this point. And then, of course, you as a consumer need to realize if this actually is possible. So we cannot have a category fully of electric vehicles in Estonia where there are only 1,000 electric vehicles and there is not enough charging infrastructure as well.
And have you had much feedback from customers about how are customers more attracted to using Bolt because of these environmental concerns? Do most customers notice?
Yeah, I think it's actually the younger generation that's more, let's say, aware of the greener options. They're happy with the scooters. They've also noticed that our rides are carbon neutral, etc. But I don't think an average user actually understands. An average user is still very price sensitive. We did a study last year amongst our customers in 6 European countries, and we basically asked them, would you use more alternative options if we had them available on our platform? And luckily 95% or so of the people said that yes, we would use those more alternative options. And then we asked them, would you still use them if they're more expensive? And then the same 95% said that they wouldn't use them if it's more expensive. So, a ride-hailing average user still is very price sensitive. Mm-hmm. So we have to figure out about this point. But still, we've even had new employees coming to our company and said, well, we read about your green plan. It's super exciting. I had other places or options where to go to work, but you actually are doing this. So it's really close to my heart, how I think, and I want to come and work for you.
Interesting. And what do your investors think of this strategy?
I think they're only happy. If you think about the, let's say, wider scale objectives, Europe wants to go carbon neutral by 2050. So I think you as an investor, you have to think if this company has a long-term strategy actually to go and be carbon neutral by 2050. And even we see that if we fill in those, let's say, questionnaires or papers for investors from different verticals and what we do as a company, then there are always questions about CSR, corporate sustainable responsibility, as well as green managing.
And Sandra, there's going to be some people listening who might be at very small businesses, maybe very early stage startups, and they might think, well, Bolt has the scale to do these kind of things. Is this kind of green strategy something that can be applied to like very small companies as well, very early stage companies?
Well, we just had a discussion with TransferWise as well. So Martin Villig from our company, and then we had a few TransferWise colleagues. And we just discussed that in an ideal world, it would be in a way that every new startup, every new company would have in their business plan, a green focus, like steps you can take to be sustainable in your business. I think it's kind of rough for startups now to think about this because they don't know where to start. And it seems like a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy still. I mean, I mentioned, we have a company, we did the verifications, we chose an offsetting company, we have to pick specific standards, we have to report every now and then. So if your strategy as a company is survival in the early phase, it's kind of difficult to think about sustainability. But in an ideal world, they would have this in their business plan. And in an ideal world, I mean, the investors would already say, okay, we're only going to invest money in you if you have those sustainability points available. So Estonian companies launched the Tech Green Plan last year. I don't know if you've heard about it.
Yeah.
So basically, so the Tech Green Plan was launched by 80 or so companies in Estonia and a few from the Baltics as well. So the idea is that we committed to going carbon neutral by 2030. So all of the companies who joined in there. And now we've been a bit stuck due to COVID. But ideally, what we would do is help how those new companies can actually figure out their carbon footprints and how to offset those CO2 emissions.
And this is like a very politicized issue, the environment. Like, how do you feel about getting into kind of politics as a business as well? And maybe some companies listening might feel nervous about getting into any kind of political debate.
When we talk about European markets, the European Commission said we need to go carbon neutral by 2050. So I think governments realize as well that they need to do something at the local level. Just last week, Lithuania announced that they're going to come out with an alternative fuels law requiring all public transport, including taxis, to use only alternative fuels from 2029. But still, I mean, it's very easy for those politicians or for the government to set some requirements, but how do they support us? So I mentioned electric vehicles, that we need to purchase those, that they're too expensive at this point for individual drivers who actually use this car as a family car as well. If it's 45,000 euros, the price per mile can be cheaper, but the initial investment that you need to do is quite high. So how can government support here? Estonian government supports the purchasing of electric vehicles with 5,000 euros per car. But this fund is only available once or so per year. And last time it was open, it ran out of funds in 4 hours. Okay. And then there are some countries that offer 2,000 to 3,000 euros per car, and it might go as high as 7,000-8,000, which is in France. But even 5,000 euros for a 45,000 euro car is quite small amount.
Mm-hmm. And Sandra, in a previous episode, we talked about how to craft a company story and looked at kind of how to build up your identity. To what extent is your kind of environmental initiatives part of Bolt's identity, and how do you communicate that?
I think it's a huge part, as this is what's our business model altogether, reducing every individual's carbon footprint by reducing your own car use, going to use greener options, what we use via ride-hailing, etc. But I mean, just Martin Villig, who's our co-founder, is the VP of sustainability now. I mean, amongst his other duties, he's responsible for sustainability. So we together form like a team of sustainability. And if you think that we have a co-founder level person working on this, then you see that it's a super important priority for the company as a whole. Yeah.
And where do you think this thing should normally sit? Kind of maybe when very small startups are kind of growing and, they don't have space yet for a head of sustainability. Yeah. But like, who should be looking after sustainability after the founder? Is it kind of marketing or product development or?
I think in this case, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, if you start with a new business project, if you start with a new vertical, new business idea, you don't even need to think, how can I offset that later? But when I start building it, how can I be more sustainable to begin with? And then, you need to have the management who's thinking about, okay, if I need to get some investments, then probably the investors are already looking at the green aspects as well. So I think it needs to come from everywhere.
Okay. So So what year did you start these environmental initiatives?
Sorry?
When did you start these environmental initiatives?
So more concretely, we started in 2019 in September when we launched our green plan. So the goal was to first be carbon neutral in all of our rides in Europe, and then to offset at least 5 million tons of CO2 by 2025. Now we've moved beyond that. We've introduced new verticals in more countries, including the e-scooters, which are inherently more environmentally conscious choices of transport, as well as we're looking at how to go climate positive with the e-scooters, but we're also changing different verticals. Like I mentioned that we don't own any cars. The business model is that the drivers come with their own cars and they offer the service as our business partners. But when we do purchase some of the cars for renting out to drivers who not necessarily have their own cars, for now we've purchased CNG cars. If electric is still too expensive, hybrid cars, CNG cars are an alternative, more friendly option as well.
And Bolt has expanded at such an incredible speed in that same time as well. So I guess your challenges must keep multiplying as well. Like, how do you work with like different city managers around the world then, or people managing different countries? How do they understand the green agenda and implement that locally?
Yeah. Just to give you first a let's say glimpse of how fast we've grown. When I joined last year in July, I was the 1,000th or so employee, and now we have 1,700 employees. So we're growing quite fast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, luckily everyone's on board with this idea. We understand that we as a company, I mean, first we need to show example in the field altogether. But then again, I mean, in order to leverage good relationships with the cities, we need to show that we are also conscious in the services that we offer. So I was formerly part of the regulatory team, and whenever we open up a new market, whenever we want to offer a new service in those markets, we need to establish relations with the city, with the government, etc. So we do have those close relationships. And when we come up with new ideas, such as climate positive e-scooters or offsetting our rides, then we communicate this to the local governments and national governments as well. We usually do have very good relationships with them, and I think we can mutually beneficial to each other.
Yeah. Fairly good relationships, I guess, is a massive improvement to kind of, I guess in the past, the perception was that ride-sharing platforms were always battling against vested interests locally and with authorities. So I guess the relationship has changed quite considerably.
Yeah, I mean, the key is, to figure out we cannot do this without the consent of the city, or we cannot do this without looking what's the city's development plan. So when we go with a new service to the city, we look at, okay, do they have a transport plan? Do they have a development plan? And we try to align our service with this as well. We cannot go into, let's say, crossroads with the city, just that each of us wants a different agenda. That's not just possible.
Yeah. And so you've added scooters.
Yeah.
I love the scooters. But like, how environmental is a scooter? I guess there's different elements of it. You've got the kind of life cycle of it, where you've got to build it and dispose of it, maintain it. And then you've got the kind of the power for it as well. Kind of how environmental are they?
Well, if you asked me 1 year ago, I think my answer would have been different. But today, I would say it's next to walking and bicycles, it's the most environmental alternative option that you could choose. So basically, there was a study done, I think it was earlier this year. That's the most cited article, basically on the impact of e-scooters on our environment. And it states that the environmental friendliness of a scooter depends on how it's made, how long does it last, and what does it replace. So how it's made. So we now from the beginning of this year, we design and manufacture our own e-scooters. So we make them 90% of the aluminium, the space-like aluminium, which is highly durable, it's highly recyclable, etc. We try to make them in a way that they're modular, so you can replace bits and pieces of the scooters if they break down. So you don't need to throw an entire scooter away. What does it replace? As I mentioned, we try to replace people to switch from ride hailing to e-scooters.
Okay.
And currently we have like 9% of those. I think
sorry, which percentage?
9% of people who switch from ride hailing to e-scooters.
Okay.
But then crucially, I think it's what's the lifespan of an e-scooter. So last year there were studies that mentioned that an average e-scooter lasts for 28 days. In which case, if you have massive CO2 emissions from producing or manufacturing a scooter, and then the scooter lasts for 28 days, it cannot be ultimately environmentally friendly, right?
Yeah.
But this was the case because Even the scooter manufacturers themselves were surprised that scooters got so popular in terms of rentals because they were produced for individual use at first. And then those platforms started purchasing those scooters and offered them as rentals. So they weren't that durable. So now the model that we have been producing and manufacturing, it's highly durable because it's specifically built for the rental purposes. Maybe let's say it doesn't look as beautiful as you would do for an individual used scooter, but it's durable, and so that's the main thing. And we've realized that our scooters can go as far as 5 years.
It gets you from A to B. I think it's fairly beautiful. I don't have any complaints about how they look. So Bolt is now a manufacturing company.
Yeah, I mean we're a food delivery company, manufacturing company. We're a taxi company, or some like to call us this way. Yeah.
It is interesting, though, because I do remember there was a lot of skepticism at first about scooters. And I remember reading an article about a year ago, and it was saying about how, they're not as environmentally friendly as people think. And one of the points they made was that they're less environmentally friendly than a packed bus. I was thinking, actually, buses are only packed kind of for 2 time periods per day. And actually, that is still pretty good. But I guess we treat cars as normal, and we give them a free pass for all the kind of environmental and other impacts they have on our city. And then we compare scooters to kind of walking rather than comparing it to cars or things like that.
Yeah, but I mean, for scooters, you need to also take into account how they're charged. So what type of electricity is available. So we just finished our internal CO2 calculations of the e-scooters. So we took into account everything. So how they're shipped, how they're transported, what kind of electricity do they use, how well recyclable they are, etc. And actually, the electricity bit is one of the biggest CO2 emitters because in some countries where they still don't use very green electricity, actually you charge the scooter locally, and this is where your CO2 emissions come from largely.
So you really have to get a complete overview of everything. I guess the more you look into it, the more complicated it gets. You think kind of measuring something like a scooter's environmental impact is quite easy, but then when you go back to find out where materials came from and how they were produced, it's a lot of research. And I guess another reason why e-scooters, kind of why people were skeptical at the time, I remember seeing a lot of pictures on social media of kind of graveyards of particularly bikes, particularly in China, where there was kind of a lot of ride-sharing startups trying to compete in a single market and kind of flooding the market with way more bikes in this case than people needed. And I guess that kind of created a lot of negative perceptions at the time. How has that kind of changed?
Well, it has and it hasn't. Even if we look at Europe, Oslo is currently facing a flooding of scooters because there are different competitors who want to access the market, and how do you win over consumers if your scooters are more visible? How are they more visible? You put more of them out on the streets. And this has resulted in the fact that Oslo, which has a population of 600,000 people, has 15,000 scooters. It's a very high number. And it's just because companies want to get their presence right out there on the streets, right? Versus in countries such as Tallinn and Estonia, we negotiate with the city. So all of the players, e-scooter operators who want to operate in Tallinn city, we have negotiations with the city. We set more or less a limit of scooters that can be put out on the streets. But this has come with the knowledge of operations. We started already last year. We started with X number of scooters. So this year we realized, do we need to adjust this number? Do we need to put out more or less, etc.? So you actually gain knowledge as you operate in more cities and then over a longer period of time.
So what is Bolt's approach to kind of competition when you're going into a new city and say you do have like an established player there already providing a similar service? Kind of what's your approach to that?
So as a lawyer, I have to say I'm fine with all of the regulations when we come out or I'm fine with all of the competition when we go to new city, when the regulations apply to all of us. So if everyone's compliant. So again, with Tallinn, we have 3 scooter operations at this point, 3.5. One of them came out quite late. We've all been at the same table when we discuss with the city, so we all have the same regulations that are applicable to us. And then, for instance, in the ride-hailing service, in some countries in Europe, we have a competitor that's known for being non-compliant with the local regulations.
Okay.
And actually, this is not favorable to us because it leads to a price war. They can be more cheaper because they don't abide by the regulations. They're not compliant. It means they can be cheaper in turn. And this is not fair competition. So we're happy when the competition is fair.
Yeah. Okay. And Sandra, I see you've added an extra service, which is Bolt Walk. So you're encouraging people just not to use your product now.
Yeah, it was actually on the Zero Emissions Day. So it was a one-day deal, but basically we wanted to raise awareness that, when you think of urban mobility and how you move around, how do you go from point A to point B, please don't forget walking.
Yeah.
Because many people tend to forget that. I mean, these days, when a ride is so cheap or an e-scooter is so close to you, you tend to forget that actually a healthier and the cheapest option is walking.
Mm. And it would have been interesting to see inside your boardroom meeting when that one was proposed. And I guess inside Bolt, I used to work for a big company and I used to sit next to our corporate social responsibility manager. And I do remember the challenges she had of getting change internally. Like, how challenging can it be kind of for someone in your position, kind of trying to, kind of make a startup kind of more socially responsible, more environmental? How can you take on those challenges?
Well, I think, Bolt is mainly young, enthusiastic people who care about the environment. So it has been quite easy. But still, let's say if I go to the product owner of a specific service and I say, we need to look at how you can offer your service more sustainability in a more sustainable way, then those product owners, those business-minded people think about ROI, return on investment. So if I have to spend more money on offering more green solutions or offering more green alternatives, what's the return on investment? And you don't see an immediate ROI because the consumers, it will take time for them to get used to it and realize that this is a more environmentally friendly option and to switch to that. So immediately they only see a cost or they only see spendings at first, and they don't see the immediate outcome as to what's the ROI. So it can be kind of difficult to explain this to very business-minded people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And also, Sandra, inside your office, what else do you do that's environmentally friendly? Do you,
Well, we have the basic stuff. You recycle. We order foods. We order muesli to the office that's made in Saaremaa, and that's not super packaged and stuff like this. We order fruit from the local retailer in the office. We're a paperless office. We use green electricity where we can. So one of the things actually that's super tricky for us is that as we all operate in 35 countries, you would think that most of those countries offer for your office an alternative, let's say, electricity packages. Well, they don't, because normally we just rent out some part of the office, especially with scooter warehouses. We rent them out for 9 months because the season is for, let's say, 6-7 months. And then to get the landlord to change their electricity package for us, it's quite tricky to convince them to do so. So we do use green electricity in offices where we can, but where we can't, we're looking now for alternatives with the natural capital partners, our partner in offsetting. So what could we do in this case?
Okay. And Sandra, we talked about greenwashing, but then I guess on the opposite end of the scale, you could have a startup that invests really well, like yourself, in environmental initiatives, and then the customers just don't know about them. And then customers can't make good environmental choices if you don't market it well. So on the other side of greenwashing, you do also have responsibility to really educate customers about what you're doing. We had a chat about kind of when you're entering a market, some ride-sharing companies, they really do kind of flood with their products in order to get that kind of market dominance. How does Bolt advertise?
Well, you just mentioned our walking category. This was a marketing campaign, right? Because we didn't charge people anything for them going for a walk. But really, so my boss says it has to be 70% of actual, focus on the project, and then you have to be able to do 30% marketing as well.
Okay.
So people would gain consciousness in this regard. And now, as Martin and I are drafting our long-term sustainability strategy, so we focus on the UN SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of them is education. education. And it's not only what we do to outside to support educational projects, it's also how you educate actually your users and your consumers to make more environmentally friendly choices. Such as, you have to go from point A to point B. You should take the first step with a public transport, and then maybe you can end up the trip with a scooter, which is what I do, which is how I go to work. But as long as people, don't have this awareness of what's their own CO2 footprint, as long as they don't have this, then they're not making those choices, unfortunately.
And you do think it's a younger demographic that is most receptive to these kind of messages?
For now, absolutely. For one thing, the younger generation that doesn't necessarily get their driver's license even anymore. Or if they do get their driver's license, they don't get a car. Yeah. Because this is consciously done so. In some cities, it's done so because they don't have parking spaces. Yeah. But then, for them to understand whether there are alternatives to personal cars, they do some research. And then they figure out what's the most environmentally friendly way that they can move around in a city.
It took me 15 years to get my driving license after I first started. And I gave up for a long time. But then we had a baby and my partner said, we need a car for the baby.
Yeah, that's normally how it goes.
Yeah. So Bolt is now a manufacturing company. Kind of, you manufacture your own scooters. What else are you doing to reduce the environmental impact of scooters?
So yes, we do manufacture our own scooters, but still, you need to think about what kind of electricity, for instance, do you use to charge them? Also, what kind of cars do you use to get the scooters out on the streets and to the deployment spots where you pick them up in the morning to go and enjoy your rides, right? So again, we're working with our partners, the NCP, to figure out how we can offset our scooters and actually even go beyond offsetting. Because the scooter CO2 emissions is not that big in itself. So how could we go climate positive with the e-scooters? Meaning that we actually reduce more CO2 emissions from the environment than we admit. So Microsoft is doing that. They're promising to go carbon negative or climate positive with their entire operations by 2030. And some other big tech companies have announced that. But no other scooter companies is doing that by the end of the year as we are promising. So essentially it means that we offset to zero, so we go carbon neutral, and then we find so-called catalyst projects, which would add additionality. So actually we then start reducing CO2 from the environment beyond just emitting CO2. So one of the easiest projects that known out there for that is protecting trees. So whether you protect the forest from being taken down, or you purchase a piece of land, you plant your own trees and make sure that they're not taken down after 20, 30, 50 years, that they stand there for 80 to 100 years, and so because trees are one of the most easily comprehensible ways of actually reducing CO2 from the environment because they create more oxygen.
I guess this is where concerns of greenwashing coming in, that you can invest in a project and, maybe the startup might not, if they don't do their research properly, they might not know kind of what happens to that project afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because many concerns come out with exactly this tree planting. You buy a tree and you pay this amount, whether it's $250, whether it's €5 or €10. But then you never know what's going to happen to this tree. Will they actually take this down after 10 years or will it be kept for 100 years? Mm-hmm. And actually, it's just a funny story from this weekend. Bolt did an Instagram campaign in the spring where we asked people to share a specific story to raise environmental awareness. And then we got 1,600 reshares of this post, and meant that we purchased 1,600 trees. And over just this weekend, we physically went over and planted those trees together with Koos Loodus, which is an Estonian company by Estonian startup owners. And so basically they had purchased the land. We went over there. And man, I tell you, it was not as easy as I pictured. I mean, I thought I would go over there, plant 10 trees, take a nice picture,
Get it on Instagram.
Yeah, but I actually planted 100 or so trees, and the land was full of nettles. So they were burning your feet, and then you had to, have to find your way through the ground with the shovels, through the roots of other plants, and then you had to make way for the tree. And I burned more calories than in a gym.
I'm sure it was worth it. Yeah. And it's good that you do know you do know the project yourself. And so the other thing I heard is about sometimes if you use these kind of schemes that you don't know much about, sometimes they can sell the same scheme to different people. So different companies think they've invested in the same trees.
Yeah.
So if you are a startup looking to do something like this, I guess the first thing to start is you need to audit your kind of environmental footprint and kind of get a full overview of the numbers, and not just the most obvious ones, but really follow things back to see how things are being made, where's electricity coming from, and things like that.
Maybe audit is a bad word because it would, scare off some people.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, you need to understand, you don't even need to go full company-wide auditing or calculations. You might start with one vertical. What's your principal thing that your business does? For us, it's ride-hailing, right? So when we started off with offsetting, offsetting our European rides. You calculated, what are the CO2 emissions of a specific car? How many rides do we do? And by this, you get your CO2 emissions. So that's quite an easy start in this regard. But then, I mean, if you want to go more comprehensive, you calculate the footprint of your office, what your people do, how much do they travel. But luckily, these days, there are many alternative options. Like you can already buy SAS tickets if you want to buy them with carbon offset already, or do you just want to buy a regular ticket that's a bit cheaper? I mean, even, in my apartment building, I could choose between an electricity package that was a regular or green electricity, which would only cost €1 more. So there are some very small steps you can do, recycle at the office. And then there are some bigger things you can do. How do you make your business inherently, more environmentally friendly?
And it's interesting that you got an independent organization in to assess that. But maybe for some companies listening, they can do it themselves? Or?
Absolutely. You can do it yourself. You can do it this yourself. You don't get a certificate on top of that. But I mean, do you actually need that? In a way, if you're a big company and you don't want to be called out for greenwashing, then it's going to become necessary. But if you're a small company and you just try to figure out how to go more green, you can for sure absolutely do this in-house.
So you've got to at least make sure it's credible. Can you credibly do it yourself, or do you need some help?
Absolutely. You can credibly do it yourself. If you want, there are always, freelancers, consultation companies out there. And many startups are actually coming out with their new solutions. There's a company called Earth Not Mars that's just coming out now. They're still building their startup, which is basically they have a calculator on their platform, on their website. You go there, you insert the things that you do. They calculate the CO2 emissions for you. And they say, okay, for this, you need to plant 1,200 trees to offset your emissions. So I think in the future, it's going to be made more and more easier for the companies out there to go greener if they generally want to do so.
Okay. Earth, not Mars.
Yeah.
It sounds like they were a bit fed up with Elon Musk's tweets, but okay. And then I guess, the next stage, once you've got that kind of calculation, you should be thinking more about how can you reduce and how can you offset. And I guess reducing is kind of fairly simple, kind of relatively kind of looking at your operations and where you can make changes. Offsetting is obviously where, as we discussed, it gets more complicated. But you think it is possible, even for very small startups, to look at schemes they can contribute to if they do their research right?
Absolutely. You can even directly find and fund your own projects. So we use a specific company and we do the offsetting via those. But you can just go online and look for how you can fund projects in the amount that you have emitted CO2. You just need to make sure that you find credible websites, right? So you need to do still some extra research on top of that. But actually, it's quite easy. Or, companies are popping out in Estonia, a company called Single Earth. They're offering to do local offsets with you. They can help you with calculations. They have bought some wetland in Estonia and some forests. So even if you're not sure if you want to do this long-term offsetting, you can rent a forest with them for 1 year and see how it works for your company.
Interesting. How important is it to do it locally, to where your customers are and make it relevant to your customers?
Well, it's quite difficult at this point for us because when we think about doing offsetting now for European rides, there are actually not too many credited projects available in Europe because it's quite expensive to start with. So what we do is now our offsetting projects are mainly in Africa. But it's nice for us because our second half of the business is in Africa. So we currently offset the rides in Europe and we actually fund the projects in Africa. But there are, save Amazon rainforests, etc. So I think the biggest impact actually comes through those large-scale projects. You can do some local offsetting as well because it shows your customers that you care for the local environment as well. But to make a bigger impact, I think we need to go beyond and outside of Europe.
Okay. This is very selfish, but very happy if anyone wants to invest in projects here in Estonia. Like more wilderness, the better. And then finally, you need to tell people about it. So you mentioned the 70-30%. You think 70% of corporate social responsibility or sustainability is about doing it, and 30% is making sure people know about it. And, we talk about greenwashing quite cynically, but actually, like, customers do need to make good environmental decisions. Like if they can't do that, then you can't. It's not going to support the environmental work in the first place. So you think about 30% should be dedicated to telling people about it.
Yeah, it's not even 70%. 30% marketing. It's rather 30% educating the people.
Okay.
Because we as a company, we as Bolt can make a difference. We can introduce as many electric vehicles in our platform. We can go with as many hybrid cars as possible. But actually, if people still see that, okay, but this regular internal combustion engine car is cheaper, I'm going to go for that. Then, we don't actually make the difference as a whole, right? So you have to go into the projects, change yourself inherently, but also you need to focus on educating your client.
Okay. And on the subject of advertising, I want to ask about your latest advertising campaign, which is in Estonian. And having an advertising campaign in Estonian isn't unusual here in Estonia. However, in London it is. So in London, you were using Estonian language in your advertising. What's all that about?
Yeah, so we did a campaign in the London Tube where we had words such as säästlik, which are probably quite difficult for you to...
I'm still learning. Yeah.
So which are quite difficult to pronounce for locals, right? So the idea is to first bring attention to the fact that we're Estonian. So we're a European company. We're not, from somewhere far away land where you don't know, how we function as a company, where HQ is, where revenues are from. But also just, try and be nice and geeky and dorky in our advertising campaigns.
Oh,
I think we got a lot of attention from Estonia.
Yeah.
We did get a lot of attention in the UK as well, but maybe not as much. Well, at least people were here happy that, we come from such a small country. Our language is spoken by 1 million people globally, right? So we extend this. And actually, I don't know if you know, but even our app can be used in Estonian throughout the world.
Oh, really?
So if we're in 35 countries, you have your app in Estonian language. You can go to, Lagos, or you can go to Riga or Bucharest, and you can use the app in Estonian.
That's cool. I didn't know that. It's interesting because there was a time not so long ago when even companies like in Estonia would try to minimize their Estonian presence a bit because there were certain perceptions, stereotypes of Estonia as Eastern European, I'm using quotation marks, kind of former Soviet country. I'm using quotation marks again for people who can't see me. And I guess that's really changed kind of recently. Estonia's reputation has changed a lot. I remember seeing products made in Estonia and it would say made in Europe on them in fairly big letters.
But this is a requirement from the EU level. So you shouldn't be advertising products coming from a specific country anymore.
But even within marketing and branding, companies are a lot more proud to come from Estonia. Is that something you've seen about changing perceptions of having an Estonian company?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to work for the Estonian government, right, in the CIO office. And I think what we have done in terms of, we have to say it's still a marketing of e-Estonia globally. I think this has helped our companies immensely. So as you mentioned, I still read articles from the New York Times or Forbes or wherever, and they start the sentence or the paragraph where they lead to explaining what e-Estonia is and saying, oh, this ex-Soviet Union country, right? So it has a bad taste in your mouth. But I think e-Estonia has evolved and gained a reputation globally that we can be proud of our company. I think slowly this, ex-Soviet reputation is falling off. Not only for us in Estonia, but also in Latvia, elsewhere in the Baltics.
Yeah.
Take Belarus for now. What's happening in this country is just awful. But still out of this picture, when they talk about the riots and what's going on, they still talk about the amazing IT atmosphere of Belarus, right? So I think these days it doesn't anymore matter where you come from when you're actually doing genuinely effective things.
And we have amazing technology here in Estonia. For me, one of the best things, though, is the environment. So actually, when we were setting up this interview, I was bear spotting, and I said I have to be quiet because I'm kind of trying to spot some bears. We do have amazing wilderness here, and that was only an hour from Tallinn. So I'm really grateful for the work you're doing to help protect our environment, even though your company is growing so phenomenally. What about you? Kind of in Estonia, you live and work in Estonia. How do you like to relax at kind of weekends? And how do you enjoy nature here as well?
Well, I told you this week I literally went out and planted some trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some 100 trees. But normally I live by the beach. So, I mean, I go biking, I go roller skating, I go jogging. My grandparents live just 200 kilometers from Tallinn. But this is where I grew up. You know, there's a forest. I just go there, walk their dog. I try to read books outside as much as possible. So if you go outside to a cafe, then I'm this weird person who's reading a book and not scrolling their phone. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think I try to be more environmentally conscious in all of the choices I make, not only how I travel, but also what I eat. I am not a vegetarian or vegan so far yet, but I still like to know where my meat comes from and where my fruit and vegetables come from, etc.
Mm-hmm. Good. And we do have a great life here living and working in Estonia. And if you haven't noticed, that's a very subtle advert for the fact that if you are thinking of starting your company, do consider starting it in Estonia and come join us. You'll be very welcome here. Sandra Särav, thank you so much for joining us today, giving us really useful insight into Bolt and really useful advice for other startups. And hopefully many more startups will be going green. Thank you.
Aitäh.
Aitäh.